Good afternoon and welcome to the Maryland Public Service Commission. Today we will be holding a hearing with respect to a report that was issued by Daymark Energy Advisors with the assistance of RLC Engineering and the ESS Group. That report, entitled Benefits and Costs of Utility Scale and Behind-the-Meter Solar Resources in Maryland, was issued in November 2nd of last year, and we more recently received comments from interested parties in February. Upon review of the report, it presents a detailed analysis on technical potential for both rooftop and utility scale solar in Maryland, and discusses the importance of state policy on the deployment of solar resources. The principal objective of the report was to detail the costs and benefits of solar in Maryland. Obviously, there are many different types of benefits, including to the bulk power system, to the distribution system, as well as societal and macroeconomic benefits that have been bucketed essentially into different categories. This report, in its first form, was provided back last spring, more than a year ago, in which the stakeholders had an opportunity to provide input and comment at a commission meeting that was held on April 30th of last year. Obviously, the authors of the report took some time between April and its final issuance in November. So this has been going on for a while, and I want to appreciate all the input and the stakeholder support since then. Obviously, however, there's limitations when you handle a report on the value of solar study of this size. We've received comments that stated that some of the benefits may have been overstated, and there was other both critique and constructive criticism that were filed in the comments, and I'm sure that we'll be hearing from some of those parties later on this afternoon after the folks from Daymark have an opportunity to present. For me, at the end of the day, I like a better understanding of how and perhaps whether the Commission will find utility in this report going forward to support our policies in the state. Obviously, in just the past few weeks, the General Assembly passed legislation that would both increase our renewable portfolio standard with respect to the solar carve-out. Additionally, we have a bill that was passed by the Assembly with respect to storage projects, a pilot storage project that would go hand in hand with any solar resources. So the state is moving forward with the solar policy. I would say it's not completely defined at this moment, but it's moving in the right direction. And we at this commission have seen a great number of great interest in the development of solar resources with more to come. With that, I'd also like to mention, with apologies, Commissioner Michael Richard cannot be joining us on the panel today, but we will proceed nevertheless. Do commissioners have any statements before we begin? Thank you. I'd like to introduce our first panel today, who will be presenting the study. We have Carrie Gilbert. She's a senior consultant with Daymark Energy Advisors. And we have Kathy Kelly, also with Daymark. She's the vice president and principal consultant at Daymark. Joining them at the table is David Littell, former commissioner and currently a principal at the Regulatory Assistance Project. Mr. Littell.
Good afternoon, Chairman Stenick, members of the Commission. I'm going to introduce the panel and talk about some process issues initially. So my role as an advisor to the Commission at RAP has been to act as an advisor to the Commission staff and the Commission itself. As you all know, in PC44, I'm just an advisor, and I've been helping the staff in the various work groups. The process for this solar study started out as a separate study, not in any one of the 5 work groups that were designated by the Commission, but as a separate study, helped the Commission scope it, prepare the RFP, and at various different aspects in the development, and then had the pleasure of working with Daymark and the prior senior policy advisor, John Cuskar, and now Molly, in preparing this study. One thing I want to note in terms of process, I don't know that it will come up, but initially, since it wasn't part of a work group, it was conceived as a separate study. Daymark had in their proposal 2 different public input sessions that they ran. That's not unusual in running these types of studies for the consultant to run them, but we decided with the staff that we needed more public input than that, so the decision was made to then fold it into the rate design work group and use that work group to solicit stakeholder comment because it was the most similar of all the work groups. So it started out separately and then was folded into that process to get more public input. Now on the study itself, Daymark approached the study in their own way. It's unique, it's different than some other value of solar studies, but it is well done. I think it will add substantially to the literature that is out there on how to do a study, whether we call it a value of solar study or a study on the benefits and costs of solar. It was done well. Many of the categories are, when I say categories, I mean energy supply savings, capacity, savings, both benefits and costs, and market suppression are common across all of these types of studies. There are some elements that are more unique to Maryland's particular interests. I'll note two here. One is the macroeconomic piece that was included with strong input that was and is of interest to this commission to look at the impacts on the Maryland economy. So that was specifically made a part of this because of that interest that was expressed and why it was included initially in the RFP. There are other states and studies that have looked at it, but it is not a usual element. So it is not unparalleled. Other studies have included it, but it is unique to Maryland's interests, and Daymark will give more detail on how they did that. In the hosting capacity analysis, it's included and detailed in one of the appendices, uses 9 different algorithms to look at the amount of hosting capacity that's available. It was performed by a subcontractor, RLC Engineering, who are very expert distribution and transmission experts. I am familiar with them as working for utilities. They are utility distribution experts. They typically don't work with state commissions or and not with public interest groups. So they're really utility distribution engineers. And what I found very useful about that is it showed 9 different, very detailed distribution engineering analysis, 9 different ways to look at hosting capacity. They picked one of the more conservative ones to approach that, but it shows the diversity of ways that you can approach the hosting capacity issue, even from a technical viewpoint, which is something I think that's lost on people that don't spend a lot of time in this area, that there's not just one way to look at things. There's multiple ways to look at it. To really take a holistic approach, it's best sometimes to look at all of the ways. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the 2 people who are going to be presenting from Daymark. Kathy Kelly is a vice president and principal consultant with Daymark. She has decades of experience as a utility manager in the industry. And now has been consulting for quite a few years. Both she and Carrie Gilbert, who is a senior consultant with Daymark, have MBAs and have worked in this area. Carrie has a particular expertise in renewables and renewable policy. So Kathy is going to introduce Daymark and Carrie, and then we'll have a presentation that will last approximately half an hour on the report.
Okay. Thank you, David. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today to do a presentation of the study. Daymark has been in the industry nearly 40 years. We've done a lot of work on all sides of the industry for various stakeholders, utilities. We've done a lot of work for commissions, done a lot of work with consumer advocate, and now spending more time with developers and smaller utilities as well in the industry across many, many issues, the economics of the industry as well as technical interconnection and other planning issues. As David said, this is about a 30-minute presentation. We welcome you to ask questions as we go, if that's more comfortable for you, or wait till the end, whichever is your preference. Commission Chairman Stanek, you stole a few of my presentation items here, but the agenda pretty much today is that we're going to go through very briefly the study objectives, some key findings, some discussion of the stakeholder outreach that occurred, and then get into more detail about the installations and the potential for future growth in solar and the benefits that were reported in the report. From a study objectives perspective, we primarily were looking, as you indicated, at the potential future contribution of solar to the Maryland generation portfolio. And then we did an independent analysis of the costs and benefits of solar from the perspective of what benefits would solar bring in the market, more than a 25-year benefit cost analysis of solar, which has been done in many other studies. So this study was looking at the revenues that might come from the market and the benefits that might accrue from social and economic sides of the issue. We did it for the 4 IOUs in Maryland, and we looked at the bulk power system benefits, the distribution system benefits, and the economic and the social benefits. And I just wanted to add to what David said about the distribution system benefits. This study moves the ball forward in the discussion of distribution system benefits and the locational value of solar, but we believe that we now, at the conclusion of the study, leave that for future discussion by the Commission and its policy discussions with the utilities as you move forward. The utilities bring an awful lot of knowledge to this table relative to this, and clearly have a very big interest in it, and they and the other stakeholders and yourselves need to think about where you want to move that forward to. As David said, the study is part of PC44. Some of the key findings: the potential for additional solar development is quite significant. By relying on the hosting capacity study, we estimated it at 19 gigawatts, which is a fairly good-sized number. The benefits are significant in the state. There's lots of value to adding solar to the system. They're similar across the IOU territories, but there is some differentiation in the treatment of capacity earnings between utility scale solar and behind the meter solar. So there's a little bit of difference there between those two. The locational benefits may be significant. It depends, of course, on the particular area and what's happening on that circuit and on that particular part of the distribution system, and it will differ across the board. But it is evident that there is benefit that can be found in that system, and that's being found in other studies across the country as well. And that solar development is adding to Maryland's economy. There is benefit in jobs, there's benefits in taxes, and there's benefits in what will be spent here in the state. With a region such as we're set up as, there's going to be benefits around the region around the state of Maryland as well, but there is significant benefit to Maryland. So our primary conclusion is that there is sufficient benefit for this commission to continue to use this report in its policy discussions and its decisions as it moves forward and as it works with the utilities and other stakeholders to continue to investigate how to include solar in the planning for the future of the system. With that, Carrie Gilbert has been the day-to-day project manager for this project ever since it started, so she brings a lot of history and knowledge of the steps that we went through to bring this study to a completion. So I'll let her do the majority of the rest of the presentation today.
Thank you. Ms. Gilbert.
Yep, thanks, Kathy. So I wanted to talk briefly about the stakeholder process that we conducted. So this started before we did any analysis in the data collection phase. We asked some questions of the IOUs, and we talked with a lot of the key stakeholders in the room to see, if they had data sources or, what information they could provide. And then, as you mentioned earlier, after we had completed our first draft, we had a stakeholder meeting here almost exactly a year ago to talk about the draft and receive feedback. And then following that, we had some requests from data from the report, which we provided, but we also had several follow-up meetings with the IOUs to discuss the hosting capacity calculation, and we did make some changes to that based on those meetings. And then an updated draft was sent out to stakeholders for comment in September, and then our final draft went out November, and then we've obviously...
Can you provide a little more color with respect to the stakeholder process? I wasn't here a year ago when the meeting occurred, but was it an open process?
Yes, the meeting that we held here, so at that meeting, we presented on the report similar to this presentation, but then we were faced the other way, as you all weren't here, and then people came up to the podium and sort of gave comments and asked us questions and like that
And
kind of thing.
we attempted to have some dialogue during that meeting. So we responded to some questions. Some questions, of course, we had to go back and do a little more investigation into. And then we provided some responses back, spoke with the team at the commission about what kind of actions we should take. And we then worked a little bit with the utilities to get better data and to upgrade some of the data that we had been provided to try and help drive more of the conclusions. So it took quite a bit more time to bring that together and move the report from April to September. There was extensive effort at that point to make sure that we address some of the concerns and include it in the report.
I believe there were some calls with the utilities.
Yes, yeah, particularly related to the hosting capacity calculation. So just trying to, and we participated in those calls, but those were primarily an exchange of information between RLC, the subcontractor who did the work on the hosting capacity, and the utilities sort of understand better how they use their system and sort of get a better understanding of assumptions between two groups.
In the original scope of work, it was intended, the study was intended to be an independent assessment with very minimal stakeholder involvement at the beginning. So I think it expanded a bit as we went through the process, but it still remains an independent report from Denmark.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the our estimates of potential. So just to ground us in where we are now, at the end of 2017, the installed solar capacity was close to 700 megawatts in Maryland, which represents approximately 5% of installed generation capacity in the state. And this graph breaks it down between by utility and the size system. And I should just also say we looked at we mentioned behind the meter and utility scale as the two larger categories of systems we looked at, but we also looked at three categories of behind the meter systems: residential, which we categorized as quite small, I think is our size term, small commercial, and then large commercial. And the cutoff between large commercial and utility scale was at around 2 megawatts, and then the cutoff between small commercial and large commercial was at 500 kW. So those were the three sizes that we looked at. And that extends through the whole study, not just in terms of installed capacity. And so we then looked at the potential for additional development, and we actually looked at that three ways. The first was behind the meter potential, and that was mostly rooftop potential. So, and then we looked at the utility scale potential, and that was mostly based on the land area that was available for solar. And then we looked at the hosting capacity analysis, and that, as you can see by the numbers, the hosting capacity analysis is sort of the limiter of the three. So you could install a combination of behind the meter and utility scale megawatts up to the hosting capacity limit in each of the utilities. And I think it's important, given the comments we had on the hosting capacity analysis, to understand some of the assumptions behind that. So we did assume that modest investments like capacitors, regulators, or short line rebuilds could happen. This was a circuit-by-circuit analysis to add up to the hosting capacity. But we assumed that large investments like substation rebuilds or long line rebuilds would not be allowed. And as we said, we did do some revisions to this analysis over the summer, which basically incorporated assumption for more redundancy in the system. So an example of this is that if a substation had, say, 3 transformers, we would assume that only 2 would be available. So it basically pared down the hosting capacity somewhat to account for some redundancy.
So there've been some claims, a number of claims that the hosting capacity in the report is too high. And I understand that what I'm hearing is that there were concerns expressed with the draft and that you addressed that, but in comments I'm seeing that the concern still remains that the hosting capacity is too high in your report.
Yeah, I think the concern is still there. I think part of that is a difference in how we're looking at the assumptions about investments like these minor investments. I think that some of the commenters would have preferred that we assumed no additional investment in the distribution system. And I think one of the comments is that this hosting capacity is greater than the peak load of Maryland. I think that comment, what I would say to that is yes, that's true. But this is showing what's possible. I think we wouldn't expect that Maryland would actually construct 19 gigawatts of solar. But this is saying, to me, what this is saying is that you have the potential for a lot of additional development. And
it also points to the fact that having identified that there is this level of development possible, if there is more work needed to take this and to work with the utilities to determine which parts of this investment should happen, what needs additional cost to be able to deal with the addition of solar, and work through this and do a better plan. This is a high-level assessment of what that hosting capacity could be, and we didn't take into consideration any finer tuning beyond that. It was not possible with the data we had and the time we had and the information. So the best we could do is look at each circuit independently and not sum it up with the total capacity with a bunch of different assumptions.
So I'm just trying to understand.
Mhm.
You would agree then that this number is sort of, like a, maybe possibly, potentially, but that the utilities would have their own information and their own, and probably good information about why one particular circuit you couldn't put anything on that circuit, or you'd have to make a large investment to put additional solar on that circuit. Because, the utilities have said this is too high, and it seems to me, and a number of parties have agreed that they would be the ones who are well suited to understand what kind of hosting capacity they actually have. And I know we have maps and all that sort of thing on hosting capacity on their websites, and frankly not heard a lot of major concerns about, they're not letting me build solar. So I guess I'm, the fact that they're saying this is high, and you're saying no, this isn't high. So I'm trying to understand how to reconcile those positions.
We see this as a level of potential that could be reached. So like other potential studies, it's probably not going to be reached, this number. I think what we're saying is that because if you look at each independent circuit feeder on their own and you sum the number up, that's a potential. Now there needs to be more work going back and looking at the utility-specific planning and having some discussion, I think, around the whole planning process and how it is implemented, to then say, how much of this can we achieve?
Mm-hmm.
So we would agree there needs to be more work on this. This was a first-pass effort with the level of data that we had available. Carrie?
Yeah, I would say that I want to make sure that everyone understands that we did have data from the utilities on the circuits. I think there's this difference of assumptions about what investments are made in developing the hosting capacity, but then I think really, as Kathy said, this is the potential, and it's great. And so, where the state goes with that, I think is the next step.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Littell.
Could I just add to that? The way that I look at that is exactly as was described by Kathy and Carrie. RLC had signed non-disclosure agreements and received utility data that was not able to be shared with the other stakeholders because of the non-disclosure issues. But that was fairly fine-grained architecture of the distribution system that typically the staff here, commissioners and others, wouldn't look at. Whether you in the future get into that or not, it is another issue. But they did do a fairly detailed analysis, and again, they're good distribution engineers. That said, it is the utility system, and at the end of the day, to make anything work, any numbers like this, the utilities are the ones that are going to make that happen or not. So I, obviously would take seriously any issues that they would raise, and I don't see Maryland in the next 10 years getting to these numbers, but if you do get to the levels of penetration at any point comparable to Hawaii or California, they have been able to work with the utility to achieve much higher numbers than were initially thought achievable or feasible. But it's up to the policymakers in this commission whether you're going to be there anytime in the near future. So the point I wanted to underline is this is a much more careful analysis than typically would be undertaken, and take it at that. But that doesn't mean that more is not going to be necessary working with the utilities in the future. And on individual circuits, there certainly will be some where issues are encountered that were not taken into account in this analysis.
Just along those lines, then, could you tell me if the analysis also considered concerns about the access to the land itself? So were you considering that these circuits were available on brownfields or in urban areas? Or
So I think that concern came up more in the first two columns, like the utility scale potential, in terms of what land we assumed was available for development. So we actually, our other subcontractor, ESS Group, did the analysis on what land was available, and they incorporated things like certain counties' agricultural land cannot be used for solar development, so that land was excluded. They excluded, land that already has other buildings on it for utility scale because that was assumed to be ground mounted, and then the rooftop analysis was looking at rooftops, so those by definition is already developed. I don't think we did anything particularly to look at brownfields development.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I just wanted to this sort of ground you for the next part of our presentation. So we, in order to determine our estimate of the benefits, we modeled two cases of solar development in Maryland, and the first one is basically not adding any additional solar, and then the second one is adding the yellow and the brownish yellow wedges to Maryland, This was, we developed this estimate is clearly below the potential that could happen in Maryland, as you saw by the previous slides. And it was based on a PJM integration, renewable integration study. They had a 30% RPS high solar scenario. And so that's what this is. And that's, we used this assumption in the rest of our modeling that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the benefits category. So we divided the benefits into three different categories: the bulk power system, benefits, the distribution system benefits, and the economic and social benefits. So the bulk power system benefits are kind of the sort of the known benefits of adding solar to your grid. And then the distribution system components, that's focusing on benefits just to the distribution system. And then the economic and social components, that includes things like health benefits, environmental benefits, impacts to water and loss of land use, and then our macroeconomic benefits. So then, on this next slide, we have the categories in blue are the categories that we're able to quantify in benefits per kilowatt hour of solar generated. And those slides are going to be included on our next slide, which is we're calling the non-macroeconomic benefits. Okay. So this slide is showing the total non-macroeconomic social benefits for the for all of those blue categories for the 4 utilities. The solid lines are utility scale, and then the dotted lines are behind the meter. And from this you can see that there, and I think Kathy mentioned earlier, there wasn't a lot of differentiation between the different utilities, and there was some differentiation between behind the meter and utility scale, but again, it wasn't huge.
So on average, that chart was showing us that it's the benefits would be about 11 cents per kWh for installation of solar.
Yeah, I think that's about right. With the behind the meter being a little bit less. And then on our next slide, we have those same benefits for behind the meter, showing over 10 years the different categories of benefits. So this really shows that avoided energy is our biggest benefit. And then on the next slide, I have those same benefits for 2028, and we have just a bar for behind the meter and utility scale to let you see a little bit more closely how the different benefits compare. Yes.
Can I back you up?
Yep.
For those top 2 categories on those bars, their health benefits and non-monetized CO2 social
Yep.
benefits, did you compare those to other non-emitting energy sources in your study? How do they compare to other sources, wind or nuclear? Or
We didn't compare them to other sources. I think they would, in theory, they should be fairly similar. I think the only differentiation would be, so those we calculated based on emissions reductions that we saw in our modeling. And so when generation occurs would matter somewhat for that. So we just didn't analyze other resources like wind, but I would think that they would be fairly similar.
should be proportionate to the emissions reduction, no matter what the source of generation. Okay.
Yeah, it should be similar. The only differentiation I can think of is, because solar tends to be more on peak than, say, wind, it might be that it's displacing slightly dirtier power. I don't know. But I would think they'd be pretty close.
Yeah, I would too. I think it may displace different power because of the timing issue, but it shouldn't be too different.
All right, thank you.
Do you have a response to the criticism in several of the sets of comments that it's problematic to add all of these different types of benefits that have been calculated using different data sets and all that just sort of stacking them on top of each other is not the best way to make a calculation? So
we were sensitive to that issue. I think we would say that this stack of benefits makes a lot of sense to stack all on top of each other because they're all tied to the solar energy that's produced. Exactly, that's how we calculated them. So we're going to talk about the distribution system benefits and the macroeconomic benefits. And I think those can be, like, they're not as directly tied to the kilowatt hour of energy produced. And so that, I think, creates more of a challenge in stacking. Like the macroeconomic benefits really occur when you install solar. So it's they're more of a per kilowatt benefit. And so in order to stack it, we had to make make a conversion basically. But I think these benefits that we're showing here, I feel pretty comfortable stacking.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we can jump to the locational benefits. So this is the same chart we were looking at before, but with the locational benefits added. And what we did here is this is another piece of RLC's work, but they basically came up with this example benefit of a 2 megawatt project, which was, if you added a 2 megawatt project to a circuit, you could avoid a $2 million investment. And so that's sort of a mid-range estimate of, it's basically an example estimate of the potential for a locational benefit from a solar project. And so, and then we calculated that over the life of the investment on a per kilowatt hour basis and added it to the stack. And I think what this really shows is that there is the potential to really increase the benefits from solar if you could site it on the proper circuits and have the information about where would be the best locations for solar. It's showing that you could really increase the benefits by proper siting. And then similarly, we've got a chart showing the macroeconomic benefits. So the macroeconomic analysis, we used a program called IMPLAN, and we put that same build out of solar that I showed earlier into the model and figured out what the benefit to Maryland's economy would be by adding solar. And this was, as I said, a benefit that I think is a little bit easier to look at on a per kilowatt basis, but here we've done it on a per kilowatt hour basis. And in the next slide you can see, so the way you want to think about this benefit is it's the per kilowatt hour number is should be in the first year of the stream of benefits. So if you had a project installed in 2019, it would get the macroeconomic benefit in the first year, because that's the year the project was installed, and then in the next years would just be the other benefits we were looking at. Okay, and then so that was the analysis we did, and we just wanted to end with some conclusions. Basically, what we found is that solar has clear benefits to Maryland, and that there's potential for a large amount of solar in the state. And knowing that the distribution benefits could add that dark gray bar, it seems that additional analysis and collaboration on the distribution benefits could, working with utilities and other stakeholders, might be able to identify the locations of greatest benefit and incentivize solar in those locations. And another thing, we looked at storage somewhat to a smaller extent in our report, but since we've completed the report, cost reductions and improvements in storage technology mean it really should be part of any future analyses discussions. I mean, there's a piece of the report where we talk about storage shifting
solar energy and that providing benefits. And I think that's just getting more and more true.
I'd like to go back to a couple of the questions, one from Commissioner Herman and one from Chairman Stanek, that goes to response to stakeholder input relative to sensitivity to the stacking and how the stacking works. In our draft report, we had done the stacking pretty much the way you saw it in that last slide, where we added each year's macroeconomic benefit and stacked all of the benefits together. And we got more and more uncomfortable with that because we realized that it was not clear in the report that that was a one-year estimate of benefits from the first year of installation, that the benefits accrue in the very year it happens, and that you couldn't then add that to every year for 2019 and beyond for the 2019 installations. It was just for 2019, for example, and that in 2020 there would be another macroeconomic benefit, but from the 2020 installations it didn't carry forward. It basically was a single-year effort. So we made some significant modifications to the presentation in the report so that we made it very clear that these may not be all additive per se, but that they are benefits that need to be recognized on the macroeconomic side, that there are reasons from a policy perspective to invest in solar, but that they are not necessarily the same benefit that you would get from the bulk system and emissions reductions, for example. The locational benefits, we could see that being additive on the specific circuits. But that was a major change that we made there. So we were uncomfortable a little bit as well with the initial presentation, and went back based on some of the discussion with the stakeholders and the commission staff and advisor, and said, we'll be more comfortable if we modify this.
Could I add to that?
Please.
So Daymark in this report has basically given 3 different ways to look at the economic benefits and how they might add. All the ways are valid. They're just, as you appreciate from litigating so many cases, there are many different ways to do these analysis, and the fact that there are different ways doesn't mean they're not valid. The way that Daymark approached this, and very carefully listening to stakeholders, underlies to me that not just in the macro analysis for this and other reasons, but in all the sections, this is a fairly conservative approach to solar cost and benefit evaluation compared to other studies that I'm familiar with. We've surveyed all the studies that have been done in the U.S., so it is a fairly conservative approach that I think is very very sort of responsible and responsive to all the input we've gotten. There are also comments from other stakeholders that they would have preferred that these benefits be leveled out over the entire life period of the solar project, which is the way that other studies have been done. There's pluses and minuses to taking that approach, but that's sort of the converse approach, and I think you'll get comments on that later. So I just wanted to highlight the differences. You've got comments from both directions that Daymark didn't go far enough in being conservative, and then on the other hand, all these benefits should be leveled out over the life of the project. They're all legitimate ways to do the analysis, just different ways that I think could inform the commission in different ways.
In terms of these value of solar studies, I know this is not the first study for Maryland. It sounds like you've reviewed other studies from other states. Is there an accepted way to conduct these studies, or are they all very different in terms of the variables and the factors that they consider?
They're not different in terms of the variables. They are different in terms of the approaches and the methodologies that are taken for each of the individual elements. So energy supply is common, capacity is common, market price reduction, sometimes called TRIPE by other consultants, are common. The general categories are common across most of the studies. I already called attention to the macro elements. Those aren't taken into account by all of the consultants and outside contractors that do it. In terms of taking on approach I'll go back to sort of the process. The commission put out the RFP highlighting the elements that were important. Distribution system value was important. It's important in all of these studies. It is calculated differently in all of these studies, and it is an element that is controversial in every single one of these studies, how it's done. And it's controversial for what I consider, I wouldn't say fairly simple, but simple for anyone who sits on a commission. Reason to recognize that there may be and probably are benefits across the system to putting on localized generation that generates on peak, right? That's fairly obvious that there's likely to be some benefit until you get into the situation of having a lot of solar. But there won't be benefits on every circuit. Some circuits may have to be upgraded, so there'll actually be cost on some circuits. So do you take the approach of coming up with an average or a median across all circuits? That would require a very, very detailed analysis. RLC and Daymark had the option of doing that. They had very good information on the system architecture. It was their judgment not to do that, and they proposed this approach that they highlighted here. So it's a different approach. It's to recognize that, hey, these are all localized benefits. The benefit could be fairly high, 11 cents per kilowatt hour on some circuits. Somewhat hypothetical, but I would say not entirely hypothetical. Why? Because they had access to and reviewed the system architecture. So RLC thought it was reasonable. Daymark thought it was reasonable. It came from them, not us. Therefore, it struck at least myself and the advisors involved as reasonable too. So that's how they got to that element. That's calculated differently than other studies.
And to be clear, that system architecture information was only available to Daymark, not other parties in the discussion?
Yeah, there are other issues, but Daymark, and I think myself and the policy advisors signed the non-disclosure, and I did open some of the files and take a look at them and quickly concluded I was not a distribution engineer, and that was not where my time and value would be added to the project.
Thank you.
Ms. Gilbert, you alluded to some counties' land use policies as affecting capacity. How granular did you get in the 24 jurisdictions in the state of Maryland with regard to availability of land in the various counties?
Yeah, it was a county by county analysis, and I was actually just looking at this before to remind myself. It's in the appendix. It was definitely a county by county analysis, and I'm not sure how much more granular. I think it was a GIS based analysis. Our subcontractor ESS did it, and so I think they had different layers that they were able to exclude or include based on assumptions. So I know, for instance, the agricultural land, because I was just looking at this, for the 4 counties that do not allow development on agricultural land, they excluded the agricultural layer for those counties.
Okay, so there were just 4 counties. Obviously, this is a public policy topic that's of very much discussion in the legislature
Yeah.
and local governments here at the commission on a regular basis, and it doesn't look like you went any deeper down than maybe a 30,000-foot overview, a GIS level kind of analysis.
I think it would be useful for us to come back with a more detailed answer to that after we talk with ESS, who couldn't be here today, and either
Yeah.
ESS or RLC could make the hearing date.
Yeah, fair enough.
So we may be taking some questions back and getting back to you in writing,
Fair
if
enough.
that's okay.
Yeah, and I think there's also an appendix on this.
Yeah. So we'll get back.
Yeah. Yep. Appendix I.
Thank you.
Throughout the report, there is an assumption that there would be an investment of approximately $5 billion. Where does that assumption come from? Can you provide a little more detail and color on that?
Yeah, so that assumption is tied to the assumption on. Let's go back to the slide. To this assumption, which is the solar capacity additions that we assumed in our analysis.
And this is based on a PGM projection?
Yep.
Okay.
So we needed for our analysis, particularly for
a couple categories. The macroeconomic benefits was one, but also the energy price reduction. We needed to have an assumption about how much solar was being added to the system so we could analyze the impact on, because one of our categories was energy price impact, so we needed to know how much was added so we could determine how that might impact prices. But in terms of the macroeconomic analysis, we had to, the $5 billion is based upon the installed cost assumptions that we made for this build out, and those assumptions were derived from, I think primarily from some NREL studies on the installed cost of solar and an assumption about that declining over time.
So there was an installed cost of solar dollar per megawatt over 10 years?
Yeah, so we had an assumption based on some of these studies for, say, 2019, and then we are assuming that solar costs are declining over the time period, but yes, yeah.
And the report also had some information making an assumption that 40% of that $5 billion investment stays in the state of Maryland. I assume the other 60% goes outside of the state. Can you provide more information on how that assumption was determined?
Yeah, so I think that is partially in the in-plan modeling. We may have to get back to you on that.
Is that more of a black box? I know that's proprietary software.
It's a proprietary software that we purchased
Okay.
and use for this effort. I think it is. We can get you all kinds of explanations of how the model works, and get you an answer as to where that 40% comes from.
Do you think, if you know, is that Maryland specific, the 40%, or if you went to New Jersey, they'd also have 40% that would be in state and 60% would be out of state?
I think it's Maryland specific because we put some specific assumptions in there as to where and what kinds of parties in the supply chain process would be in Maryland versus outside of Maryland.
Okay, I would hope so, but that would make sense.
Yeah, I definitely know we do that.
More generally, I'm sure you've had an opportunity to review the comments that were filed earlier this year. There was a concern among a number of commenters with respect to the lack of transparency behind some of the calculations and the modeling. Obviously, with in-plan, it's proprietary software, so you can't share that. Do you have any general response to those concerns?
I would say for all of the bulk power system calculations, we also used a proprietary model to do some of those calculations, but they are industry standard. Most of the numbers can be compared to any of the other folks who do that kind of forecasting, so I think you could see that most of them are they're all in line with other forecasts. I think we were very transparent about the assumptions we made that went into those models, and most of the people who are reviewing the documents and reviewing the study have sufficient capability and access to their own modeling so that they can do the same comparison. So I think while we did some of the work without a lot of stakeholder deep intervention as we went through it, I think they are pretty much industry standard and are not really suspect from that perspective.
Thank you. Do commissioners have additional questions? Seeing none, I am going to ask that you folks stay at the table, and we'll move forward with our additional panels, and you may be asked to respond to additional questions based on the commenters, okay? We may actually have to have one of you give up your seat, Ms. Kelly. Linda, are you okay to keep going? Are you okay to keep going? Okay, all right. At this time, I would like to call up members of the second panel, which represent Maryland agencies and utilities. This includes
They need this computer.
Bill Fields, Deputy People's Counsel, Maryland Office of People's Counsel, Dr. Ryan Opsahl
On that end.
Like that.
of the Maryland Energy Administration,
Okay. She wants us at this end.
So two and then me.
Linda, we're off the record for a minute or two. Yes.
Stop the music right now.
Okay. Should just start the slideshow.
Yeah, it'll come up in a minute. Why is it not showing up? It's two different screens. So this, where is your?
Those are like lazy boys. You can't see anybody behind the front row.
Okay. I know this has worked before, so. Right, but it's usually it works.
So you're up to 40.
You're not first, right?
The background's screen.
This is it. You're gonna go last, so let me go. I will get somebody to come in and get it up. Yep.
Front screen, back screen.
No, different. All right, we're back on the record. The two additional members of the panel are Justin Felt, who is a manager with Strategic Planning Office at Baltimore Gas and Electric, and Steven Steffel, manager of Regional Capacity and Planning at Pepco Holdings Incorporated. Mr. Felt, would you like to start us off?
Well,
Or we have computer.
we're going to start with the other side.
Okay. All right, Mr. Fields, we'll begin with
okay.
you and work from left to right.
That's fine. William Fields with the Office of People's Counsel. We certainly share a number of the concerns I think that you're going to hear about if the technical difficulties get resolved regarding how the different types of numbers here should be looked at. We, of course, looking at it from the consumer interest, have focused on the bulk power system benefits as well as the health and societal benefits to a lesser extent. And we certainly were one of the parties that had concerns about how that information was presented in the graphs and had concerns. We called it the gray bar issue in the office, that large gray bar on some of the charts that you saw representing the economic or potential economic benefit of doing a significant amount of basically construction work in Maryland to install solar. It could be a little misleading to certain parties or certain people from a policy perspective to indicate that there's going to be this large 20 or 30 cent per kilowatt hour benefit that that utilities are going to see or that customers would somehow see in their bills, which we don't think would be the case.
So when you refer to the gray bar benefit, you're referring to the macroeconomic 1 year benefit?
Right. I'm talking about the macroeconomic benefits. In the one chart they showed it as a single year, and then in other charts they've stacked them on top for all of the 10 years, which I think is a representation of, and it's still a little confusing to me, I'm looking at page 3, it's a representation of the macroeconomic benefits from the 2019 installations. They're shown for 2019, and then there's a bar for the 2020 installations, and then going down through 2028 for the installations that come in each of those years. But you can't really think of it as a sustained benefit of 30 plus cents. Eventually, I think the additions would slow down or cease, and then you would be left with, going forward, just the non-gray bars or the colored bars would be the benefits that you see, and that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about this, particularly from a rate-making perspective, which is kind of the perspective that we were focusing on, and looking at the bulk power benefits that they projected. And the first point on that really is that what I wanted to make was that those bulk power system benefits, they are a projection of basically PJM wholesale market prices over 10 years, multiplied by the amount of power that would be expected to get from various levels of solar generation. Basically thinking about it that if someone bought this power and then resold it back into the PJM markets, that's the revenue that would be expected. And one of the things that I think needs to be kept in mind on that is that any projection like that is probably not going to be right. It may be close. Some may be closer than others. And if we think about this from a rate-making perspective, you're thinking about what customers might pay or what utilities might pay for that power. If we're thinking of the value in that sense, you also need to think about, well, what's the risk and who's taking the risk of those projections being wrong. If the reality turns out that the PJM prices are much higher, who's going to get that benefit? On the other hand, if it turns out that the PJM prices are lower than projected, who's taking that risk? Because that represents a potential loss. Is it going to be customers taking that risk? Is it going to be owners of solar generation taking that risk? That's something to think about in terms of these bulk power projections. I also wanted to mention we made some comments on the issue of the benefit to the distribution system, which was just talked about a little bit. And we certainly don't dispute the idea, well, we don't discount the idea that it may be possible to avoid some distribution upgrade work based on distributed generation on the system. However, and we have an illustrative example in this report that says, well, if you could avoid a 2 megawatt project based on a $2 million investment, this is what it would be worth. Or I think I said that backwards, but at any rate, it's in the report. And what this report doesn't help us move forward with, really, though, is trying to identify how many of those possibilities there are on the system, any particular utility system, which is very critical to know if you're thinking about, well, what might it make sense to pay someone for solar for their solar output. If it's really there's just one opportunity like that, well, that would mean that certain amount of output has a value to the system, and perhaps it should be compensated, but it would only be in a certain location and a certain amount. It wouldn't tell you that any and all solar on the system would have that value. It could turn out that there's many opportunities on the system, and then maybe more of an average approach might make some sense. It's possible. I think the utilities, I think it was pointed out, You certainly need a lot of information from the utilities about that. And the second point I wanted to make on the distribution benefits was to talk about something that we agree with the report, where they say that additional analysis and collaboration is really critical to getting a handle on what benefits there might be to the distribution system. And we think that's really an opportunity. There is an opportunity at this point for the Commission to explore those types of questions in terms of the utility planning of the distribution system, to get a better handle, not only the Commission but also stakeholders, policymakers, to get a better handle about what opportunities there are and what limitations there might be. We're, in the situation we are now, there was discussion about this exchange of proprietary information. There's just not information out there for policy type consideration of what may be possible for the distribution system in terms of avoided costs and what that might mean. So we think that that's something that really should be pursued and thought about in terms of getting more transparency into the state of the system and what the utilities are intending to do with it moving forward, and what opportunities there might be for cost savings. So I think that's the extent of the particular comments that I wanted to make. Again, I think we have some similar concerns to what other folks are going to say, but I don't want to get out in front of them and repeat things that other folks are going to say. So be happy to answer questions now or after they go through their presentations.
Well, why don't we hold questions until the end of the panel? Dr. Reinopsel.
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. Thank you for having me. Here today to provide comments on the Denmark value of solar study. In general, our accurate understanding and assessment of the continued expansion of solar throughout the state is of utmost concern going forward. Grid stability is a real concern, which is why proper consideration must be given to the growth of such intermittent renewables, both behind the meter and utility scale. Better understanding the expansion of such renewables is imperative as deployments progress and in some cases accelerate. Furthermore, the expansion of solar power throughout Maryland is consistent with efforts maintained by the state and Governor Hogan to expand the use of renewable energy in support of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, reauthorized by the Governor in 2016. It is clear there are both tangible and intangible benefits to the state by taking such actions. The Denmark Value of Solar Report is meant to be a cost-benefit examination of additional utility-scale and distributed energy resources on the grid by examining the overall value of additional solar installations throughout the state. Many value of solar studies have been generated in other states, and generally speaking, these types of studies do represent two approaches to understanding value. One is a constrained cost-benefit approach. This type is well developed and accepted for understanding the best way to assess the value of a particular project or piece of equipment. It is a disciplined approach, and applied to this case would demonstrate the value of a project to maintain the electric grid at acceptable levels while providing the agreed to revenues to electric utilities. Primarily, we need to understand the minimal resources required for proper maintenance of the grid while keeping the cost to ratepayers as low as possible. The other approach looks at direct cost and benefits, but expands the analysis to include intangible and sometimes speculative assessments of value. This presents a problem when attempting to assess the validity and necessity of costs that will eventually fall on Maryland's ratepayers, and as such should instill a sense of caution in all concerned parties. We have several concerns regarding this report, which were presented in our written comments. But I would also like to highlight the valuable submitted written comments by Edison Electric Institute and Borlick Energy Consultancy, both submissions which include, I think, very important critiques of the macroeconomic related aspects. So I will not reiterate all of our previously submitted written comments. However, I would like to mention the lack of transparency in certain sections, especially the macroeconomic section of this report. There are, of course, many components of such a report that for legal or business reasons cannot be revealed, such as proprietary business data. That's perfectly acceptable. However, key areas of such a report submitted for review to a state government should be open to scrutiny. This report, juxtaposed against others, especially relatively open and transparent value of solar studies, especially university ones that originate in the academic community. Compared to those, this is relatively opaque by comparison. While MEA and several parties submitted critical written comments on this report, it should be noted that that is a drawback that we encountered, and I'm sure others encountered as well. And that's especially the lack of access to the proprietary models that were used. I would also like to point out the critical issue of land use. Even though the report reflects a discussion regarding local planning and zoning requirements, a more robust discussion should have been added to these sections given the many land use issues we encounter in Maryland, and this should have served as a significant restraining factor for Daymark forecasts and their land availability. In order to demonstrate one of the problems here, in the Daymark report, section 5.2.4, forest habitat, they state forest habitat has the potential to be impacted by development of utility-scale solar projects. However, due to the added cost to clear forested land and the availability of agriculture and vegetated land, it is unlikely that there would be interest in installing solar facilities on existing forested land. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to that hearing in Charles County where they're going to be discussing the Georgetown issue where about 200 acres are going to be plowed over and there's going to be utility scale solar installed there. So that should breed some caution on some of those land use issues. While the report has some good sections on bulk power system and distribution system benefits, many portions of this do read as an academic exercise to explore the value of solar. As such, we would urge caution in these areas, especially if you're going to use it to inform or influence rate design or solar policy. Thank you for having me today. I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Steffel. Oh,
Right.
Mr. Felt.
We'll go this
Okay.
way. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Both Steve and myself will be sharing the podium here. And the joint utilities, which includes Baltimore Gas and Electric, Pepco Maryland, and Delmarva Power Maryland, welcome this opportunity to provide testimony on the Daymark report. We've been a positive, constructive voice in solar policy development in Maryland. Throughout this process, from April onwards, we've been engaged both with Daymark as well as stakeholders. In a supportive role, we want to ensure that policy and rate making accommodates solar in a way that maintains system reliability and customer equity. I mentioned our engagement, so we spoke at the April 2018 hearing. We also worked with Daymark, as they mentioned, on the hosting capacity calculations. We also filed 2 rounds of comments and did speak with some staff representatives as well in August. So despite our efforts to make this report a better useful report for the Commission, we unfortunately concluded that the report is conceptually flawed and fails to provide an accurate determination and portrayal of the benefits, costs, and solar energy potential referred to as hosting capacity. We'll go into each of these, but the significant flaws relate to the macroeconomic benefits, as the other people have mentioned, avoided distribution investment, the portrayal of that, the avoided energy cost, and direct market costs and benefits. And Steve will also talk a bit about our concerns regarding technical hosting capacity. So we don't view this report as an appropriate reference for rate making and policy. So I'll go through each of these. I'm not going to speak to each point. As was mentioned before, the macroeconomic benefits is a large portion of the value of solar calculations. Behind the meter, it's between 20 and 25 cents per kilowatt hour. We have 2 central issues with it. The first is that we do support that economic analysis has a place in policy rate making and policies. But when you're thinking about rate making and actually resulting in a per kilowatt hour reference, that gives the analysis more precision than it actually can entail if you do include economic analysis. The M-Plan model and other economic modeling platforms involve a lot of assumptions, and that includes a lot of uncertainty. And so to give it that illusion of precision is not appropriate. In addition, the approach, in terms of the macroeconomic modeling, we also have an issue with. The view is that it's really presenting half the story. It looks at the solar jobs and the economic benefits of solar, but doesn't include all the benefits that would be accrued by investments in foregone investments like natural gas, nuclear. In other words, it's a gross, not a net view. In terms of avoided distribution investments, we did agree with Denmark that installing solar is something that involves a lot of different factors in terms of, you're looking at location and other factors for distribution perspective. Our concerns are regarding the misleading references to an 11 cent per kilowatt hour cost benefit of solar. As mentioned in the report, it is illustrative, it's hypothetical, as Mr. Littell had said. However, it's also listed in all the value of solar figures, 59 by our count. So a reader of this report would be, it would be a misleading indicator to them that there is a value, and really it's just an illustrative calculation. We gave that feedback in multiple forums that 11 cents should be scaled back in terms of representation, and that did not end up becoming an edit in the report. Avoided energy costs. So this is obviously something very, very key and a valid part of any value of solar calculation. Our concern is on something more technical. The future view of the avoided energy cost involves projections, as Mr. Fields mentioned. Looking at the modeling and framework that they utilized, it's based on 2017 assumptions from EIA. If they had used a 2018 EIA forecast or had looked to traded markets on NYMEX, they would have come up with a projection for energy costs that would be lower than what was included. So our conclusion would be that if they had used more recent and less outdated data, that would have different conclusions, especially in the out years. And as well, on the REC market costs and benefits, the value derives on the front of the meter side from the creation of the REC, the Renewable Energy Certificate. However, when you also look at some of the stacked benefits that are on top of it, non-monetized CO2 social benefit, several others, you'll see that those would conceivably also overlap with what you would view as RECs. RECs are essentially the embodiment from a policy perspective of the value of the renewable energy. So that constitutes double counting from our perspective. And I'll pass it out to Steve.
Thank you, Justin. So we'll continue and take a look at the technical hosting. We believe it's an unrealistic estimation of hosting capacity. And as you know, we did develop hosting capacity maps and under a DOE grant. They've been up on our website for a number of years. First of all, based on the report, as well as our interactions with Denmark, the result is pretty much a simple use of the thermal ratings of substations and conductors. And the algorithms, there were nine of them. They kind of are combinations of these different things with different types of limits. And if you want, we could go through them eventually. But it ignores certain aspects of standby for reliability reasons. It avoids the thought that you don't have evenly spread adoption. You're going to have pockets, you're going to have high penetration areas and other areas where very few people are putting in solar. It doesn't incorporate any safety or operational issues that arise, and we'll talk about some of those in just a moment. Now, hosting capacity is generally accepted across the industry as the ability to accommodate DERs, and mostly it's focused on solar because solar is the big player in the game, under the existing grid conditions without any major upgrades. Yet the report contemplates a grid that becomes a net exporter of power during the day, and it's a net exporter of power during peak. But just remember, minimum daytime load at the middle of the day in the springtime is about a third of this. So just imagine the export that is going to occur at that time, magnitudes. And it doesn't envision that the other areas of PJM and our other neighboring utilities are also putting in solar. So if we all adopt solar at this rate, we will just have so much excess power at certain times that, we either have to have extreme amount of batteries or whatever. And the other aspect is that it doesn't think about what would be required for the grid. New technology, and really none of that major expense has been incorporated into the analysis.
Mr. Steffel, if I could stop you there.
Yes.
You've replicated this chart in your comments, I think on page 8 of your comments. We heard from Ms. Gilbert a little while ago that, for instance, for Baltimore Gas and Electric, 11,029 megawatts, that is just the hypothetical maximum that would be permitted on the BG&E system, notwithstanding the fact that the system peak in, imagine, the summer of 2017 was more than half of that amount. Can you respond to her explanation that this is that 11,000 megawatts is just the hypothetical? It's not an amount that I think the Daymark folks would expect that BG&E would actually have to host?
Well, I'll respond in this way. When we talked with Daymark, we said, if you want to call this some other type of information or number, please do so, but don't use the term hosting capacity. Because what I gave you was the hosting capacity is used by the industry that calculates all the limits on a circuit, and it doesn't just look at the thermal limit. Basically, the thermal limit is what's the maximum rating that the substation transformer can take, and what's the maximum rating that the conductors on the circuit can take. We don't even load them up that high for load. So, it is maybe one way to look at things, but it's certainly the term hosting capacity probably should not be associated with that. And I'll tell you why, and I'll explain a few things. I'll give you some examples of what's going on, what our initial findings of hosting capacity that we investigated with DOE, and just some other things to think about. When we did a DOE study back in 2015-16, we took 20 very different circuits across the PHI service territory, and they are representative of some dense urban, some rural, and across the board, so they really represent our different circuits, and a couple different voltage classes, because we have several voltage classes. And with some adjustments to the circuits to, in a sense, optimize them a little bit. So we actually did things like phase balancing and a number of other things. We had an average of 26.4% penetration hosting capacity on those circuits. That was the average to start with. Some had more, some had less. So that's a very reasonable number to have hosting capacity at without considering upgrades or added cost. In New Jersey, just to give you an example where we're at, we have 13.4% penetration, but we have 14 circuits, 7 substation transformers that require upgrades to continue adding solar on those circuits because of reverse power conditions and so on, and the protection schemes that need to be put in. The cost there is $4.9 million. So it's not negligible, but we're wrestling with it because we don't want any of the residential customers disadvantaged on those circuits. We have one transformer in Maryland. We have a 7.2% or penetration here in Maryland. That's the PHI part, the DPL and the Pepco Maryland. And we have one transformer that has reached that same point where we're going to have reverse power, and we need a protective relay scheme to prevent a problem that could occur on that. That one I don't have the exact estimate, but they're usually between 200 and 500,000 to mitigate. Now that's an aggregate impact. So we were adding many systems up until the point where the next system that needed to be added had that more expensive upgrade. And so right now, no customer can pay for the upgrade that's needed, so they're not adding. One of the other impacts that we're having is on distribution automation. And if you've been following we've been improving our reliability year over year with adding distribution automation schemes that isolate faults and transfer the areas that are not faulted to adjacent feeders to pick them up. But we have several that are being impacted because there's so much solar in that section. The relays passing back data to the scheme, the logic scheme to operate, see negative loads and so on, and they can't operate. So we're going to upgrade them, but just be aware there are a lot of impacts, and if we don't spend the money and upgrade those type of things along the way, we will have, reduced reliability. So I'll leave it there, and if you have questions, we'll answer them. We can talk about the 9 algorithms if you want, but I don't want to delve into the details that you're not interested in.
So, Mr. Steffel, just curious, you're saying that their estimate is too high. Is there some sort of a, you should cut it in half, you should cut it, by 2/3, by 1/3? I mean, is there some sort of a, in your mind, way to address that concern by saying that, okay, well, they've gone much higher, but the reality would be 50% of that hosting capacity, or some other number, or is that just not, as obviously as an average, not as a, with respect to a particular circuit? Is there some estimate that you could give that would make sense in your mind?
Well, I did give that estimate in the beginning, the 26.4%. Now, what I will say is the path that we're on, we're going to put ADMS, Advanced Distribution Management Systems, in that will manage the automatic line equipment, such as voltage regulators and capacitors and LTCs, load tap changers at the station. And there's plans for DERMS, Distribution Energy Resource Management Systems, which, when put in, and if they interact with inverters and do some coordinated control, we can increase hosting capacity tremendously. So I would say 26.4% is probably reasonable without thinking of changing the system in magnitudes, and then it can go up significantly as we do a lot more coordinated control. But that's going to take secure communications, low-cost communications out to the edge, and then allowing some coordinated control of all the devices.
So help me out, Mr. Steffel, because you threw a lot of numbers around. So 26.4% of what?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The penetration limit, or the hosting capacity in this case, would be 26.4% of the peak of a circuit. And that's basically what hosting capacity is defined as, the percent of the peak that you can handle without significant upgrades.
Of that number for PEPCO 3054, 26.4% of that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
That's
Just
correct.
wanted to make sure I had the right number.
Right, and where we're at right now is about 7.2%.
And you're
On an
currently at
average,
7.2%.
on an average
there.
basis. The problem is, of course, you got penetration levels that are real high here and none here and so on. So you kind of have to deal with everything in a local basis. But if you go across the board, we have about 7.2%. Penetration, that's the amount of solar capacity over the peak.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Opsel, you talked a little bit about land use, and you heard me ask a question of Daymark about land use. And of course, MEA is well aware, as we are, about the controversies surrounding land use and how you probably really have to get down into the nitty-gritty, not what is designated agricultural land, what is designated forest land, what is, developed land, but you really have to get down into the current body politic of each local jurisdiction to figure out what's going on with regard to available space to put this. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, Commissioner.
And you probably would have to use the Maryland Department of Planning expertise to really get a good understanding of both the state level programming and the local programming. And with all fairness to Daymark, their contractor ESS isn't here, so But do you think there was any of that went into this study beyond what percentage of land is agricultural, what percentage of land is forested, what's the 30,000 foot level comprehensive plan in each jurisdiction with regard to restrictions? Anything below that?
Unfortunately, Commissioner, there wasn't much below that. Like I mentioned, there was some discussion of zoning. I think they kind of did what they could, but in this case, given the land use issues that we actually do have in the state, it wasn't enough to do that 30,000 foot view.
And those issues are not insignificant. It may seem like a small point to focus in on, but in regard to development of utilities, especially utility scale solar in this state going forward, those issues are of paramount importance. And we see it all the time in litigated cases before this commission from the various counties. And each county is very different in its posture and outlook, as are the local communities. So that's why we're asking about this. Thank you for that. I wanted to understand your comments there. Mr. Littell, I wanted to go back to this whole notion of hosting capacity. And in our PC44 process, we had an interconnection work group I'm sure you're aware and familiar with. And it sounds like a lot of what Mr. Steffel was talking about was stuff that maybe could have been addressed in our interconnection working group processes. How close did the study of solar and the interconnection work group, did they pass in the night, or what happened there?
I think that's accurate. An accurate observation, with the caveat that I think the interconnection work group kind of got to I hesitate to characterize it as 2.0 or 3.0 version of interconnection, and I think where that would meet is a much more advanced.
1 second. Is that an alarm? What is it?
It's one of the alarms. Molly's going to email Vince. Thermostat.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Continue. I just want to make sure it wasn't a fire alarm we were hearing.
Okay, so we're good. So I think the two would and should meet. In particular, when you're doing interconnection analysis or distribution planning analysis, oftentimes a hosting capacity study will be undertaken, or evaluation as part of those. It is very important when you do that to kind of scope out the purpose for which it's going to be used, not just at that level, but at a more fine-grained level when you're doing distribution planning or interconnection, which both can use hosting capacity, but for different purposes. So you could waste your money and time by doing a generic hosting analysis like this, thinking you're going to use it in that process before you scope that out, which is, I guess, another way of saying that I think this analysis would be informative and valuable for either of those processes. I don't know that it's sufficient to perform that interconnection when you get to the level of advanced interconnection considerations, which, and this would be my last point, I think one outcome of this could be that the Commission could conclude that you may want to get there sooner rather than later. There are these IEEE standards that have been updated and are on the way, and there are very important decisions for the Commission on how those are to be implemented. And a lot of some commissions are saying, well, we'll wait for those to be filed with us. Well, that's sort of letting the case come in without saying what you'd like to see in them. And there are some portions of this report that are non-controversial, so you're not seeing a lot of testimony on them, but some of them are on the inverters. Advanced inverters have the capability to provide grid support, particularly reactive power support and frequency regulation, and some other local ancillary services, which aren't even valued or quantified. In this report, they are valued or quantified in some other studies I'm familiar with.
So I think it's fair to say that absent that stuff, we won't have the full picture here.
Yeah, so I think you could get there, and you could get there sooner rather than later, but you may want to say, as part of a broader policy discussion, what the legislature says and the Commission says. there are different pieces, but you could say, and there are these important benefits, and we'd like to see those installed and activated on all new inverters that go on in the state. There's a cost to solar owners of those, which is not insubstantial, of activating those, and so the solar installers and the solar owners won't do those unless they're instructed to do them or compensated for them, one or the other. There are some other, at least one other RTO, not PJM, has instructed that some of the advanced capabilities are to be activated, the ride-through capabilities. Separate issue, but that goes to reliability. And so that they dictated that from on high. I don't think anyone will challenge it, but whether an RTO has that authority, that's a separate issue. So there are some important findings on the value that these advanced systems can bring into the distribution system that you could realize sooner rather than later by getting other proceedings going. And if it's just, perhaps an outcome would be as simple as telling the utilities, with input from other stakeholders, this is what we'd like to see in your plans, and we'd like to see them filed sooner rather than later to realize some of these benefits and perhaps avoid, even if they're small, some unnecessary investment in the local grid infrastructure. And there's a related issue, if I could, that I would point out, is I believe some of the system upgrades, the advanced grid capabilities that I believe and understand some of the utilities are already implementing ADMS and DERMS at certain levels. Those types of advanced grid capabilities were anticipated to some extent by RLC. So we have a little bit of comment that, well, we need these advanced capabilities. RLC assumed that many of those capabilities, as part of ordinary grid modernization under the distribution filings from the utilities, would be made to enable that type of grid flexibility that does not exist in an older grid, exists in a newer grid, and you have good utilities in Maryland by and large, so there was an anticipation of some of those advanced systems coming online. Exactly which ones, if the Commission desires, Daymark, I'm sure, could check and clarify exactly what capabilities were anticipated to come online as part of that hosting capacity analysis.
I've been hearing these IEEE 1547 standards were going to be imminent for a couple of years now, but does anybody know where they're at?
Oh yeah, they actually have been following it too, asking this. Yes, I do know where they are. They are finalized now. They are out. They are done. And so the posture now is, well, what is each commission and or utility going to do to implement them? Which is why I raised the issue. The utility could, on its own initiative, start a process to do that. There's a progression that anticipates. I've been in briefings with some of the drafters of those standards at NARUC meetings, and they've anticipated filings of utility plans in 2020, 21, 22 timeframe. So that's not as far away as it used to be. But again, I think there's perhaps a role, if the Commission wants to get ahead of that and not be reactive to what's filed, to say what capabilities you'd like to see. And this is a much broader issue than solar. It's storage, it's wind farms that use inverter-based technologies. What would you like to see on the reliability side for ride-through as well as voltage support and frequency?
Thank you.
So a couple of questions. Just to follow up, Mr. Littell, is it RLC?
Yes.
Yeah, if RLC did consider or include that they would have these advanced systems that Mr. Steffel was talking about in the analysis, was the cost of those systems included in the analysis?
No, I think that their assumption, one, we need to clarify for you exactly what was assumed, and I think that's reasonable to have done, if that's important to the Commission. Number two, I think they assume that, as we were seeing, and as I'm seeing in almost every jurisdiction I'm working in, their proposals from utilities to do this, and to some extent or another, they're going forward in every jurisdiction. So I think they assume that capability would be put in place over the near to intermediate term, within the 10-year time frame is another way to look at it.
But they didn't add the cost of that into the analysis of the value of the solar. Wouldn't you take that as sort of wouldn't you subtract out the cost of that when you're looking at the value of solar? Because in order to have the solar, you have to put these systems in, right?
Well, I think that's up to the commission, obviously. But one way to look at it is that those investments are proposed and going forward, regardless of whether the solar is installed or not. So
But
are
it
they?
still impacts the cost of the solar, doesn't it? I mean, the fact is it's going in, whether it's going in or not, doesn't it impact the cost of the solar?
It impacts the amount of hosting capacity that could be accommodated on the system. And if it's not in place, it certainly impacts that figure, how much solar could be incorporated. And so there's sort of a chicken and egg issue, if you will, is if the solar doesn't go forward, if for some reason a lot of the incentives that exist are taken away, are the DERMS and ADMS not going to be installed? Will those proposals be scaled back? That's not a question for me, that's a question for the utilities. But in most jurisdictions, I'm seeing those proposed regardless of where they're at on solar and where they're intending to go on solar. In other words, I'm seeing those proposals to implement those in states that don't have a significant solar industry. So, and my understanding of, I won't speak to your process, you're an expert in your process, but how much you review and approve that type of thing as an ordinary cost or an extraordinary cost, that's an issue that you know much more about than me.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Fields, you seem to be recommending that we implement the distribution system planning work group as envisioned by the notice way back when.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions as to, or recommendations as to what the goal, what is that working group trying to achieve other than learning more about distribution planning?
I think the goal would be to establish a system where the commission and stakeholders get some level of transparency into some of the things that Mr. Littell was just talking about. What's coming on the system over in the future, and how much, why is it going to be done, or why are they planning to do it? How much is going to cost? What are the drivers for those different investments? What do they accomplish? I think the working group itself, the goal would be to establish an ongoing process, because these things are going to change over time, all the time. But to get a level of transparency into that, and it's not, the point is not to get the same kind of detailed knowledge that Mr. Steffel has, or to that level. You have to put the right level on it, but to get the right level of understanding of what the utilities are planning to do, so that we can understand better when we look at things like this value of solar study, or discussions about implementing storage on the system to potentially avoid distribution upgrades. What are we talking about? Here we're talking about potential for solar installation to avoid system upgrades. Are we talking about different upgrades with those two things? Are we talking about the same type of upgrades that would be avoided by both of those things? That would be some of the questions we try to be able to understand going forward based on the work of the working group.
So it would be, I'm still trying to understand what, it's I understand that you want the information, but how would the working group propose some sort of a process by which they would get the information? I'm trying to understand that.
Yeah, I think that the working group would propose a process where the information, comes from the utility to the stakeholders and the commission, and then a discussion of what then is, what is done with that information. How is it processed? How is it dealt with? Those are the things that the working group would be tasked with coming up with.
Okay. And sounds like integrated resource planning 2.0, maybe?
Well, it would be looking at some aspects of that. We're thinking to focus on, the distribution system, obviously, and
Sure.
what the needs are, what the real cost drivers are in the future, and what the opportunities are for avoiding some of that cost, and determining, hopefully in advance whether, what parts of it are cost effective and what aren't.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Field.
Thank you.
Follow up on that last discussion. Follow up on the last discussion. Mr. Fields, are you familiar with the DOE-sponsored NARUC-NASIO task force on distribution planning that's just kind of kicked off at all?
Yeah, not in detail, no.
Okay. It's a 16-state collaborative effort between the state energy offices and NARUC commissions from around the country. Will involve some stakeholder process, although I'm not sure how that's going to work quite yet. But it's a high-level, kind of develop some guiding principles for the states to consider. Obviously, not dispositive with regard to what you have to do. Maybe if we delay a little bit, that national kind of task force might inform the working group at the local level if we have an opportunity to do that. So it might be a timing thing, kind of what I'm suggesting. But you may want to take a look at that. I appreciate your suggestion.
I will.
Though. I think there's merit to it. Thank you.
Ms. Gilbert, you've heard a lot of comments and criticisms regarding the study from this panel. Do you wish to respond to any of those in particular?
I think we tried to respond in our earlier comments. I guess the one thing I would say is, the comments about some of the inputs to the analysis being out of date. I would say that we would agree with those as well, but we did do the report a year ago, more than a year ago, really, because we did our first draft, I think, like in January of 2018. So I think that's a legitimate. We would expect if you were to, however anyone wants to use avoided energy, they would calculate it with the most recent assumptions at the time. Yeah, I think we also expressed a difficulty in figuring out how to stack some of the benefits as we talked about earlier, and we tried a lot of the revisions to the report were trying to explain how the benefits could be stacked and explaining what we meant by each of the categories. So I guess I'd encourage to read the text and see if that helps. And then the hosting capacity, I think I'll leave it at what we said earlier.
Okay. Thank you. I think we've addressed that issue, even if we are not on agreement. Ms. Gilbert, while we're on the topic with you, although none of the panel members here raised the issue, I did note on page 91 of your report, you state the vast majority of utility-scale resources would be fixed panel systems.
Yes.
And I recall, no need to look at the actual page site, but I recall that there were commenters that disputed that fact and noted that there's increasing, if not the majority of systems now are on a single access. Can you explain if there is a discrepancy between the statement in the report and what's actually happening on the ground?
I would say that that was an assumption that we made in order to calculate the benefits, and so in terms of our report, I think perhaps the only place that comes up is in the capacity credit calculation, and so on page 91 we have basically the capacity credit that PJM is giving these different resources as their starting assumption, and if you were assuming a tracking system, you would just get more credit and the benefits would be higher. In terms of our report, that's the only place that would matter. Potentially the timing of the capacity factor of
utility scale resources with tracking would be higher. So that would, I'm trying to think where that would impact, because most things are on a per kilowatt hour basis. So I think, I haven't looked at data recently on the percentage of tracking versus fixed, but in terms of how it matters with the analysis, I think this is the one place.
The only place
I think
in
it's
the
the only
report.
place, yeah.
If I could, would energy and market price suppression be marginally higher?
It could be marginally higher because there would be marginally, because of the capacity factor issue. So a tracking system is going to have a higher capacity factor by
Higher capacity and energy factors.
well, I think the energy benefit is on a per kilowatt hour basis, so it doesn't actually matter if you have a higher capacity factor resource because you're just looking at the benefit on per unit of energy generated, whereas the capacity would matter because we're taking, a capacity is a per kilowatt benefit, and we're converting it into a per kilowatt hour, so there would be some, there could be some additional benefit there. And David mentioned perhaps the market price effects, because you would be, in our modeling, we would have a greater energy generated, and that might cause a slightly greater decrease in market prices. So basically, we would be adding a little bit more zero-cost energy, and that could decrease the marginal price slightly, but I really don't think it would be much of an impact at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Gilbert. At this point, we're going to take a brief 10-minute recess, and then we'll start the next panel at approximately 3:05, and we'll get started a little early. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. We are back on the record. We apologize for those in the back of the room. It's sweltering right now, but help is on the way. We now have the solar stakeholders panel. We have a last-minute substitution, Adam Benshoff, Executive Director of Regulatory from the Edison Electric Institute, Dr. Robert Borlick, Senior Energy Advisors with Borlick Energy Consultancy, Carl Rabago, Executive Director of Pace Energy and Climate Center, and we have David Murray, Executive Director of the Maryland, D.C., Virginia Solar Energy Industries Association. Thank you all for being with us today. Mr. Benshoff, would you like to get us started?
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman Stanek, and thank you, Commissioners, for having me today. Allison Williams certainly sends her regards, though she is at home with a 2-year-old with a double ear infection, so I did not offer to babysit. I offered to come here. But thank you so much for having us today. As the Chairman said, my name is Adam Benshoff, and I run regulatory affairs for the Edison Electric Institute. For those that might not be familiar, EEI is the association that represents all investor-owned electric companies. So I have the distinct privilege of representing some of the largest clean energy companies in the country, as electric companies provide virtually all of the wind, nuclear, and 69% of the solar across the country, which equates to about a third of the clean energy electricity resources that are on the system today. Our members provide electricity to over 220 million Americans, and last year alone invested approximately $113 billion in bringing on smarter energy infrastructure and resources that will help with bringing on solar and really lay into today's discussion. As we at EEI and at the industry continue to support the clean energy transition, we think it's important that policies are evaluated in a smart way and result in payments and rates for all resources, including solar power, that are efficient and equitable. And you'll hear out of my organization safe, affordable, reliable, and increasingly clean often. And it's something that you hear from the industry, and I think all facets of that are important to keep in mind as we look at things like value of solar studies and the like. EEI recognizes the really substantial effort that went into this report and are grateful that the Commission has provided not just this forum, but additional forums as well, where I know my colleague was here to participate, to provide comment into the final report. There are just 3 areas that I would like to sort of reinforce today from our initial comments and our written comments. First, I'd like to just take a minute to place the Daymark study sort of in the context of other solar-specific studies that demonstrate that it is a little bit of an outlier when it comes to sort of the final determination. And I would posit that maybe not quite as conservative as we've heard it framed earlier this afternoon. Then I'll focus on the economic benefits portion of the study specifically and discuss and really under the rubric of sort of rate making and what impact that would have when we're looking at this through that lens and possible uses of the Commission of this report. And then conclude really with that, with a discussion of how the Commission could use this report and what we think the value of it could be to all of you moving forward and really to the state of Maryland. I think to kick off, it is important to put the study in a little bit of context. Given our national footprint, we are familiar and pay attention to solar valuation efforts really across the country. It's useful to look at sort of where the Daymark values stand in comparison. In 2015, a group called Environment America compared the outcomes of 11 different solar valuation efforts. The highest value came from the Maine Public Utilities Commission, and that was only at 34 cents a megawatt hour. So still about 8 cents lower than we see in the current study here for Daymark. The utility scale solar value seems to be equally above what we've seen in studies across the country. Now, while the Daymark report was done for the Commission, it does seem to fall prey to some of the same problems that we've seen in solar valuation studies as compared to sort of other generation attributes. And chiefly, it's through the inclusion of economic and social benefits that are really difficult to quantify and verify. Yet these elements, when combined, make up the bulk of the sort of value stack that we saw on the slide earlier this afternoon. In one instance, if you look, it's roughly 80% of the distributed solar value comes from that economic, health, or environmental benefits section. I just caution, when considering the merits of a solar value category, most commissions across the country have opted against the inclusion of these type of benefits. The primary reason is that they're hard to quantify, they're not market-based, and there's not really a credible proxy for them. So it's very hard to verify them in a way for customers. I would point you to the Arizona Corporation Commission, which spent nearly 2 years studying and reviewing the cost and value of distributed solar specifically. And in its final order on the value of DG, the ACC made clear that the determination about the inclusion of non-market-based elements, so that sort of stack of values that we're talking about, was that we agree with the parties who argued that quantifying the societal and economic development benefits of solar is a speculative endeavor that has no place in rate making. And I think I just want to reiterate, if there's one thing that you sort of take away from my discussion here, it's that linkage. It's the linkage between the report and rate making that has us concerned as we look at sort of how these studies can and are used across the country. Now, there's a number of other studies out there. They're in the record, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but one in particular that's probably worth taking a look at is Oregon's study. The Oregon process determined their value parameters through a stakeholder-driven process run by a firm called E3 that has done a number of studies for commissions across the country. They seem to work exclusively for public service and public utility commissions. And ultimately, the Oregon Commission agreed that that the solar values would exclude all economic, social, and non-monetized elements. So it just went in a little bit of a different direction than the report that we have today. I'm going to touch briefly on the economic benefits calculations, that sort of biggest line in the graph. The study relied on a well-established in-plan model, the input-output model, to determine employment and job years from direct, indirect, and induced employment. In-plan is an incredibly useful model, but with all models, it's only as good as the assumptions and inputs, so those have a tremendous impact on sort of what comes out of them. So it's crucial, I think, to understand that in-plan does not capture trade-offs in any way when you're thinking about what that stack looks like, whether they're job-related or financial. And I believe Daymark has acknowledged that their economic benefit calculations are gross and not net. So in other words, they've captured only the benefits of this additional solar, but not the costs associated with other jobs, other economic activity, or the relation to other resources, which we would argue in sort of a full suite of resources is probably a little bit of an oversight. It's absolutely worthwhile to understand the economic impact of any policy decision, and jobs modeling is valuable and insightful. In Daymark's case, the attempt to aggregate pardon me, speculative economic benefits into a single solar value stack, and we heard a little bit of this earlier, and then into a kilowatt hour value is a bit unorthodox and we fear unproductive in this context. Again, linking it back to my comment earlier about the potential impact that it could have on some sort of rate design or valuation of these resources themselves. I actually believe that Mr. Rabago's City of Austin rejected the inclusion of jobs as a solar benefit. Is that untrue?
Yeah.
All right, you can correct me then. Because when you read the order, it appears to have rejected the inclusion of jobs as a solar benefit in the value of solar tariff. Similarly, Oregon's value of solar excluded as well as New York's value of DER. So using jobs as a measure to inform any sort of rate design, except specifically crafted economic development rates, is inconsistent with accepted rate principles. And if the Commission is really interested in understanding the potential economic impact of a single resource, that exercise should be understood as hypothetical and really removed from the consideration of rates more broadly. And that really brings me to the conclusion. and that's that the Daymark report, Daymark's produced a report that placed its results in sort of a common unit of measure, the kilowatt hour. So when we reviewed it, and based on the press clippings that I saw when the report was released back in November about it being sort of the position of the Maryland PSC, others read it the same, and that it was going down the path of rate design. And that's really why we're here today, to caution the Commission about sort of making that direct link. If this report were merely a thought exercise, I think it's a solid catalyst for a broader discussion about the role that solar can play in the state of Maryland. But if the intention is to use it to inform rate design or compensation, that's where we would express some caution for the Commission. Properly understanding solar's value means evaluating it against other available resources. If, for example, action were taken to build out the amount of solar projected, the questions become about the cost, what other resources come on and offline, and we heard a little bit this afternoon about that health benefits portion and it being calculated based on emissions reductions. But I'm curious if we've included in there at that penetration level what that does to sort of the general PJM stack, and if that has an impact on which resources are being backed down and aren't, depending on how much solar is on the system. So I think there's a host of variables when we're looking at these, and I think it's important to consider all of them in the conversation. So in summary, we all share the same objective: increasingly clean energy, an affordable electric system for all customers, and one that's reliable. We would encourage and are really eager to continue to participate, and once again thank the Commission for the opportunity in a productive conversation about advancing solar and other clean resources in the state of Maryland. But we hope that the Commission would exclude this report specifically from any type of rate making or other consideration as the PC44 process moves forward, and may be beneficial for the Commission to clarify its position on the report, given some of the reporting that we saw during its November release and the sort of positing of where the Commission is. So I thank you again for the time and really appreciate the opportunity to sort of pinch hit here for my colleague.
Mr. Benshaw, thank you. Before I forget, you referenced twice reporting in November 28 timeframe regarding the Commission's position on this report. I don't recall off the top of my head what reporting that is. So can you tell us what you're referring to?
Absolutely, Chairman. If you Google Maryland Public Service Commission Daymark study, when the report was released in November, there was some press coverage of what it meant for the state of Maryland. There was a headline indicating that if Governor Hogan wished to stop solar, that his commission was now in his way. So there's some framing out there that just may be helpful for the Commission to understand as it thinks through sort of an order or what it plans to do with the report moving forward.
I believe that was when the draft release was the draft report was released for stakeholder comment. If it is possible that a stakeholder released it or brought it to the staff's to the media's attention, it's also possible that staff from the Commission reprimanded those stakeholders. So rest assured that if it was inappropriate, my understanding is it would have been dealt with, hypothetically.
I will also add that contrary to popular belief of some parties, we maintain our independence, and we won't be characterized by other parties whether they have an interest or not.
Thank you. Dr. Borlick, good afternoon.
Hello. 1, 2, 3. Okay, it works. I'm Bob Borlick. I'm a semi-retired independent consultant in Washington, D.C. I'm not representing anybody, so I don't have any dog in this hunt. My interest is just to see that that whatever gets implemented is in the best interest from a societal perspective. It's economically efficient and it's equitable. So, let's see. I reviewed Daymark's study some time ago, and I conclude two things, three, I guess. One is that it grossly overestimates the benefits. And secondly, that it presents its findings in misleading formats. In other words, it takes all of these benefits and presents them in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour. And this is misleading because it suggests that you can compare this, say, with the levelized cost of a gas-fired combustion turbine or some other resource, and that's not the case. And secondly, I don't think that this study really contributes much to the Commission's stated desire to be able to use it to come up with some potential scheme for setting future utility tariffs. My second major point is that if you really want to do that, you really should explore the idea of going to the buy all, sell all model, which Austin Energy implemented in 2012, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. But actually, Carl Rabigo was at Austin, and he was responsible for this program, so he knows more about it than I do. Getting back to Daymark, the most important flaw in the study is that it counts the increase in Maryland GDP and jobs creation as a benefit that's additive to the value stack, and that's just not the case. What GDP additions and jobs creation represent are simply a different look at a project's net benefits. It's a different manifestation. It's sort of like looking at two sides of the same coin, and you notice that the head side and the tail side are different, and saying a quarter is really worth 50 cents. It's not. It's worth 25 cents. There are some other flaws in the study, but they're overshadowed by the state GDP addition. One is quantifying the benefits over a 10-year period, in which case Daymark has ignored the fact that solar facilities produce benefits over a much longer lifetime. Typically, 25 years is used. Another one is including the market price effect, or DRIPE, as a societal benefit. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. It's not a benefit. It's almost fraudulent to say it's a benefit. Let me put it that way. And what it represents is simply a transfer of wealth from the generators to the customers. Now, you might think that's okay. It basically sums to zero from a societal perspective. If you think it's okay, then you have to consider what would happen if the generator simply decided not to produce electricity. A generator has to recover its costs, and if it doesn't, it goes out of business. Or more likely, in this situation, what the generators will do is they'll go to the PJM capacity market, and whatever they can't get in the energy market to sustain their operation, they'll simply get through the capacity market by bidding their resources in at higher prices. So this DRIPE effect at best is only temporary. It's only temporary until the capacity market and PJM catches up with it. There's another issue, and that's counting the avoided REC purchases as a societal benefit. They're not, but I'll address that a little bit later. And lastly, the study, I suppose the study wasn't tasked with this, but it shows the benefits from rooftop solar and large-scale solar as being approximately equivalent. But what it ignores is the fact that large-scale solar produces electricity at about half the cost of rooftop solar. That's it, at least at the bus bar. It's not quite that simple because you have to take into account the cost of transmission to get it to the customer. But even so, even when you put in all of those nuances, it's very, very difficult to overcome the 2-to-1 cost advantage that you get from large-scale solar. Now, some of Daymark's confusion is probably understandable because the benefits that they listed have been listed by other studies, and in particular were demonstrated in a Rocky Mountain Institute study back in 2013. Let me just jump to the graphic. This is the graphic that came out of that study. These are the various benefit components that they had identified by reviewing 15 assessments of the benefits, the costs and benefits of solar. And they start out, they classified these things into these concentric circles, with the core benefits being the ones that are generally agreed upon, that there's consensus that these are valid, and that there are agreed upon ways of getting at what their value is. And then as you move further outward, the benefits become more speculative and more difficult to quantify. Financial security, we're talking about fuel price hedge. I haven't seen any analysis that definitively shows you how to handle that hedge. Market price response, that's DRIPE. I've already talked about that. Security and risk, I'm not sure what that is. I didn't focus on that. Now, the environmental benefits, these are real. And frankly, I would have moved the environmental benefits further up, closer to the core. I think that they can be valued and quantified. And lastly are the social benefits, and that's the GDP and jobs creation. I've already talked about that. Here's a summary graphic of the 15 studies that was behind this Rocky Mountain report, and you can see that they vary all over the map, and partly they vary based on who the client was that funded it. Vote Solar came up with the highest number. SAIC, that was for Arizona Public Service, was a very small number. And then E3 did a study for the CPUC, which California Public Utility Commission, which came up with a massively large cost of integrating the resource. I didn't review that study, so I'm not sure what E3 did. I did review a subsequent study that they did for the CPUC, which was pretty good. Okay, now let's talk about how to compensate distributed solar PV. As you know, as most of us know at least, that solar PV is compensated through the net energy metering virtually everywhere, except maybe Austin, and I don't know of anywhere else where it's not. And this is a case where the utility, the customer basically consumes the energy that he produces, exports some of it to the grid when he overproduces it, and then takes it back for a credit when he wants to use it. Because of the way the net energy metering works, the utility is effectively purchasing the customer's energy at his retail energy rate, and in particular at the volumetric component of the retail rate. And since that retail rate, the volumetric component, is typically greater than the utility's avoided cost, we end up with a cross-subsidy, because the utility has a shortfall which it has to make up by raising rates and charging other customers for it. And the last point is related to this relative cost of utility scalar versus distributed energy rooftop solar. NEM is inefficiently subsidizing a resource which could be better performed by large-scale solar at a lower cost. Maybe. It depends on the particular circumstance. But I won't get into that. I talked about, I mentioned that net energy metering typically overcompensates and creates a subsidy. This is the CEA study that was submitted in this docket. It's a 2018 update of a study that I had actually done in 2016, but my study didn't include the state of Maryland. As you can see, the total subsidies that rooftop solar in Maryland receive essentially pay for the entire upfront cost of the facility. It's just that it doesn't get paid, the customer doesn't get paid in a lump sum, he gets it over time. I would guess, I don't know the exact number for Maryland, but I would guess that this is about a 10-year payback. And after that, the customer enjoys free electricity for the remaining life of the facility, which is probably a couple of decades. Oh, I might also point out that if you look at this may be a little hard to see, but the net energy metering subsidy is about half the total subsidy in Maryland. The other subsidies are, the federal tax credit. There's a 30% tax credit for that. And there's some state rebates, which I haven't looked at. And there's, and there's the RECs. The fact that they also get the value of the RECs that they can sell. I'm not going to address this, just say that this same study was also done looking at what happens if the solar facility is actually owned by a leasing company like Solar City. And when you do that, the actual subsidies explode, by a factor of like 40%. But those subsidies, they don't benefit the customer. Solar City keeps those. The leasing company keeps those through the contract that they negotiate. So if Maryland chooses to stay with net energy metering, they should really consider setting up a separate rate class for solar customers and try to recover all or most of the utilities' fixed costs through a portion of the tariff that's not a volumetric rate. And the closer you can get the volumetric rate to the utilities' avoided cost, the smaller will be the cross subsidies and the more efficient will be the whole process. Now, obviously, this is in direct conflict with existing existing regulations in Maryland. So the COMAR would have to be changed. Moving on forward, there's a better alternative, and that's the buy-all-sell model that I mentioned earlier. But again, that would require a change in COMAR. Here's how the buy-all-sell model works. The customer basically, all the energy that he consumed is measured by 1 meter, and all of the energy that he produces with his solar facility is measured by a second meter, and that energy is basically exported to the grid. So you keep these two things separate, and you charge the customer for his consumption at the prevailing retail rate. And you pay the customer for his solar generations, for solar production, using a value of solar price. Now, Austin did this in 2012, and they basically revised that value of solar price on an annual basis, primarily based on what the ERCOT energy prices are. It started out at about 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's been revised downward, down into the 10, 11 cent range since then. I'm not sure where it is today, but I'm sure Carl does. But I submit that there's even a better way to implement this model. And since we already have smart meters, and typically these meters meter at 15-minute intervals, there's no reason why we can't calculate the credits at the 15-minute interval basis, looking at what the PJM LMPs are over that interval and multiplying that by the energy that the customer delivers in that interval. And in this way, it's a dynamic rate, and it's much more accurate than having to forecast ahead what the single tariff would be, the way Austin Energy does. Utilities are also capable of calculating the marginal distribution losses in each of these intervals using their SCADA data and uplifting the energy credits for that. They can also go back at the end of the year and figure out what the solar facility's contribution was to the capacity in terms of capacity by looking at how much less the utility paid using PJM's well, it used to be the 5CP cost allocation method. Now it's modifying a little bit, but basically it's looking at the peak loads in the year, and pro rata allocating the capacity, the total cost of procuring capacity to each of the load serving entities. So you can do that. Now, avoided distribution system investments, as people have talked about that earlier. This is really a feeder by feeder issue, and it has to be addressed at that level. And I think the only party that can do that is the distribution utility. When they identify that there's a feeder that's in need of upgrading, they can provide ad hoc incentives for solar facilities to locate on that feeder, or for the existing facilities to continue to function. Then we get to avoided emissions costs. We can calculate those also based on the social cost of carbon. It also involves identifying the marginal generator in each 15-minute interval. I'm sure PJM has that data. It's a complicated calculation, but we're living in the era of big data. Computers are capable of handling that. And lastly, we have the distribution utility, how it deals with SRECs, solar RECs. I've had a change of heart on this last point. Driving up from Maryland, they came up with a different idea. So let me step to the next slide. A REC is defined as capturing all of the environmental attributes of renewable energy, including the emissions benefits. Now that's a legal definition, and and I'm not a lawyer. I'm somebody that was trained in the STEM disciplines, so I don't quite buy that. But nonetheless, there's no doubt that a REC is at least partially capturing that. So if we compensate avoided emissions, and we also purchase the RECs, we're basically overcompensating the solar facility in doing so. So we can do one or the other, but we probably shouldn't do both. If we look at what the actual costs are, the avoided emissions costs from national gas-fired generators are in the range of 2.5 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, $25 to $30 a megawatt hour. The Minnesota Value of Solar study came up with numbers in that range, and I've independently calculated these numbers, and they're about right. Over the past 2 years, if we look at where Maryland SREC prices were and where they are today, we find that up until recently they were in the $10 to $20 range, which is less than the avoided cost of emissions. But they've recently spiked up to the $50 to $60 range, which is considerably more. So we have to, one way of breaking this conundrum is for the utility to pay the avoided cost of emissions as we calculate the $25 to $30 a megawatt hour. But in return for that, requiring the solar facility to hand over their RECs to the utility so that they can sell them into the market, or use them for their own benefit to satisfy their own renewables responsibility. So that way we sort of get benefit both ways, and that's the best I can do, the best I've come up with. Doing that, because SRECs by Maryland law currently assigns the ownership of the SREC to the solar facility owner, so that would have to be changed to accommodate this. And that's the end of my chat. Maybe a little longer than you expected.
Thank you, Dr. Borlick. Always learn something new. At this point, we have Professor Carl Robago.
Hi, I left the microphone away here, but I hope that you can hear me. Hi, my name is Carl Robago. I am the Executive Director of the PACE Energy and Climate Center. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, for your attention to this important issue today. I'm going to run through some very quick comments here. I'd love to spend the next 2 hours after that talking about what Mr. Borlick and Mr. Benshoff next to me said wrong, but that's okay. No, I'm kidding. I just thought I'd liven it up at this late hour. I am appearing here on behalf of Earth Justice, the Fuel Fund of Maryland, the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, and Solar United Neighbors of Maryland. We've been involved in this process in PC44 from the very start. The PACE Energy and Climate Center is a project of the Pace University Elizabeth Haub School of Law in White Plains. For more than 30 years, we've been working to advance clean energy policy and development. And we started a lot of this issue about 30 years ago, in 1990, when we wrote and published a reference work called The Environmental Costs of Electricity. I actually wrote a small subchapter on cooling water intake structures and the 316B lawsuit, and and that study, by the way, relied on a lot of great work done here in Maryland. In 1992, I had a chance to serve as a public utility commissioner for the state of Texas, and I had a chance to meet speculative endeavors right up close when I got to sit on the rate case to put the Comanche Peak nuclear power plant into rates, a plant that had been approved at $750 million 20 years before we voted on it, and was a $12.4 billion rate case when we got to cast that vote. In 2002, I had a chance to take my work to the next level when I co-authored, along with Amory Lovins and others at the Rocky Mountain Institute, a reference work called Small is Profitable. That book won Book of the Year recognition from The Economist and detailed more than 200 distinct benefits associated with right-sizing energy resources. It remains the definitive treatise on the operational, engineering, financial, and economic benefits of distributed energy resources, and was used to write the very first value of solar studies done by Ed Smeloff in California, and then by the city of Austin in 2006. In 2011, I had a chance to work again on these issues when I was a vice president for Austin Energy, the municipal utility for the city of Austin. I used the value of solar study that we had commissioned back in 2006 and updated every year to index the compensation rate for distributed solar generation produced by customer generators in what is now called the value of solar tariff. Doesn't exactly work as a buy-all, sell-all. Since inventing the idea of a value of solar tariff, I've worked on value of solar studies and issues in several states, including Minnesota, where I helped write the legislation, Maine, North Carolina, Arkansas, and others. At home in New York, we at PACE have been involved from the very start in the value of DER, Distributed Energy Resources proceeding, that is at the center of the New York Reforming the Energy Vision process. So you can imagine how excited I am to be here today. And I hope you'll believe I'm qualified to offer just a few more remarks. I've expounded on these issues in greater detail in my written comments, so I'm not going to repeat those or read those to you, but I do want to just highlight some points to you. Point number one, thank you. Thank you to the Commission and to the staff for creating and running a process that's been very open and transparent with abundant opportunities to comment. Number two, the Daymark report really does a pretty excellent job of showing its work. I've looked at these studies everywhere, and I can tell you that much transparency that is in the Daymark study is less common than you would expect. We can have serious discussions about this report, as we have today, because of the transparency, because of the way they explain their methodology. Number three, the report supports, first, one very important overarching conclusion. Solar energy development and operation in Maryland brings immense potential benefits over a large range of capacity additions and over at least the next 10 years. Fourth, the report does not attempt to characterize the full resource value of solar generation over the useful life of solar facilities. Instead, it calculates an annual avoided cost value for a limited set of attributes for only the first 10 years of those units, which are expected to last for about 25 years or more. Simply stated, that means the Daymark did not do a true value of solar study, as that term is often used, and did not do the kind of study that would allow that information to support full valuation of solar as a resource in an integrated resource plan, for example. The report does not address community-scale distributed solar or the increased value and reduced costs that kind of deployment and customer aggregation could yield. Even more benefits are available from those configurations. The report describes and recognizes but does not quantify or propose quantification methods for assessing important distribution level values associated with the operation of distributed solar, including hedging value, locational distribution value, and the value of ancillary services. But I want to leave you with just a couple of additional points. Again, more comments in more detail in my written comments, but even with all the limitations that I cite in the report, you should be left with great confidence that full retail credit for distributed solar production, whether used on-site to offset consumption or exported to the grid, is reasonable, fair, and likely results in solar customers providing net benefits to the grid and other utility customers. In other words, this report this conservative report that leaves out a lot of value makes it absolutely clear that under traditional net metering arrangements, solar customers will be subsidizing both the utility and their fellow customers. Second, there's a great foundation here for you to work from. At Austin Energy, like I said, we were on our 6th update of our value of solar tool when I first used that data for a successor tariff for net energy metering. The report can be improved incrementally and can be used to evaluate other distributed energy resources, at least the methodologies. The flaws should be addressed, of course, but you've got time to do that, and maybe the distribution planning work group can take up some of that work. So my recommendations in the end are 3. Accept the Daymark report and its fundamental conclusion that solar energy development and operation brings immense potential benefits. Recognize that full retail credit, whether used to offset or export or for exports, is reasonable, fair, and results in solar customers providing net benefits. And use the report as a foundation for more important work. Putting it all together, I think this is the context that you face. You're in an environment where there is increasing policy pressure for an accelerated shift, not just a business as usual, but an accelerated shift to high renewable systems and decarbonization. You have number 2, you have a study that says there will be great benefits if you do that. Number 3, you've got a bunch of utilities and utility people telling you that if you just take solar in isolation, there are problems and issues with doing that. So given number 1 and 2, and number 3, I think you should direct the utilities to solve their problems so you can achieve the policies, reap the rewards, and move forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor. Finally, today we have David Murray, Executive Director with the Regional SIA organization.
Thank you, Chair Stanek and members of the Public Service Commission. My name is David Murray. I serve as Executive Director of MDV-SIA. We represent the solar industry here in Maryland. My comments will be brief, and just to expound upon my written comments, they're just a few technical ones in nature. Mr. Chairman, you referenced the single-axis tracking system as affecting the capacity factor and in turn the capacity credits that solar facilities have. And I would like to point out that single-axis trackers are increasingly utilized within the industry. I believe the report calculates it at about 42% of utility-scale facilities. Just for reference, in Virginia in 2017, about 88% of the solar energy capacity was installed with single-axis tracking technology. That's because the technology has become increasingly affordable. Second, you are seeing higher DC to AC ratios on utility-scale solar facilities, which also increases the capacity factor for these projects. What that means is these utility-scale solar farms are being built with more solar panels on them, simply because the price of solar panels has declined significantly, that it makes sense to essentially overbuild the project in order to take advantage of those shoulder hours early in the day and late in the day, and really provide additional power to the wholesale market. And so, as we pointed out in our comments, we're now seeing DC to AC ratios grow from 1.1, 1.2 to 1.4 and 1.5. There was also an issue with the behind-the-meter capacity crediting system. It double discounted, where it applied the capacity factor to the capacity credit factor, meaning that behind-the-meter solar was undervalued in that respect as well. I think that we are hearing a lot from different stakeholders that we should not view solar in a vacuum. We should consider about the economic impact of what happens when we remove, say, gas and coal from the system. But on the other hand, we should exclude the environmental and social benefits of solar. And so I think that some of the other stakeholders need to have it want it both ways, where we don't want to compare solar to other forms of generation when it comes to environmental and social benefits, but we do want to compare solar when it comes to economic benefits. And to expound upon the economic benefit argument. In our comments, we also mentioned that the report narrowly looks at the labor income. So they have the current, I think it's $160 per kilowatt of economic benefit, and that would only be true if solar were just the men and women who were on the rooftop on the day of the install. As you all know, solar consists of electricians, permitting inspectors, sales professionals, overhead, all of that, and so that's why we recommend using the National Renewable Energy Laboratory economic assessment number, which was about $270 per kilowatt. And I'll close with to what my colleague at PACE said when he mentioned that this report essentially calls for a rapid growth of solar, but with being mindful of the transmission and distribution level implications of it. And I commend Delegate Corman for the energy storage legislation that was passed this recent session, which really took a lot of the work that has been done at this commission to determine different pilot programs for the implementation of different energy storage technology in Maryland, and I think that energy storage is going to be an ever-increasing component of the work that's being done at this commission. The solar industry is more than welcome to be a part of that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Questions for the panel? Commissioner Herman.
Mr. Rabago, I'm not sure exactly where you stand with respect to, we've heard from EEI and from some of the other parties at OPC that we shouldn't use this report for rate-making purposes, and I'm not sure whether you agree or disagree with that. I kind of heard that you maybe agree, but I just want to, I'd like to, get your opinion on that.
Well, yes. Everything you do impacts rates, right? Every order, every requirement you impose on a utility or you excuse them from, everything, every project they propose that you approve or disapprove is going to end up impacting rates. So to say that the value calculation should not be used to inform rates is to say that you shouldn't do your job. You shouldn't pay attention to whether or not this kind of generation will make electricity more affordable, less affordable, more reliable, secure, or increasingly clean. Did I get them all?
You got them.
Okay, so yes, you have to. You have to use this study to inform rates. You have to use it to tell you whether or not you feel like you need to go much deeper to see if there really is a cross-subsidy that works against non-solar customers. The study says, no, you don't. That informs whether or not you're going to work on that. Whether you should initiate a proceeding to impose, as some commissions or utilities have proposed, excess charges on solar customers in order to reduce the economic benefits of going solar.
Let me stop you. That's not really, what I'm asking. And
should you set the compensation rate based on this study?
That's I think where.
Yes, and this is how you should do it. As I said in my closing, you should be absolutely confident that if you retain net metering, you will not be creating a subsidy that flows from non-solar customers to solar customers, because this study shows that the value that solar generation produces exceeds the compensation credit they would receive under net metering.
Right, again, but I think what I'm hearing from some of the parties that have concerns is that the numbers that are in that report should not be used for setting for utility tariff development at this time. I mean, that's what I heard.
And so the way I just said it, that you can leave it with that full retail will be less than the value of solar, therefore you will be safe leaving full retail net metering, is how you can inform it. Should you take the number in any one of these years and set it as the mandatory compensation rate? No, I'm not sure. I think I don't think you'd be hurt. The study clearly makes it the study makes it clear that a cross subsidy would not occur if you use what they call them, the non-macro. And you'd be shortchanging solar customers by all the distribution system benefits because they have no values for that. But you could, and you wouldn't create a cross subsidy. But what I'm telling you is you're safe staying with net metering, and that And I think that would suit the solar industry just fine for the distributed generation system, and you have comfort because of this study that that's not creating a subsidy, notwithstanding what Mr. Borlick said.
Okay, thank you.
Would any of the panelists like to respond to?
Do I get a chance to respond to that?
Dr. Borlick.
Well, Carl, I don't know what report you read, but I don't get that at all from this report. If you strip out the GDP, the macro benefits, you come up with numbers in the range of, what, 7 to 10 to even, 7 to 10 cents today, going up maybe to 11 cents in the future. I'm not served by BG&E, but my guess is that their volumetric rate is around 12 cents. Isn't that true? Can anybody tell us what that rate is? My rate from Pepco is around 13.5 cents.
The representative from BG&E is nodding about 12 cents.
Okay.
Yeah, 12 cents is more than 7 or 8 cents. To me, that's a 4-cent subsidy. So how do you respond to that? And well, let me say this: that 12 cents, the 7 or 8 cents, includes two components that shouldn't be there. One is the DRIPE benefit, which is it's around a half to 1 cent right there. And secondly is this REC, this business of avoided RECs. You got to realize that, yes, it's true that BG&E avoids having to buy RECs because their demand is lower, and therefore by law they don't have to have as much renewable energy. But if you believe that renewable energy is providing a benefit to society, we're losing those benefits. You got to net that loss of benefits off against the price of the REC. And since the price of the REC represents the difference between buying energy off the market, null energy they call it, off PJM, versus buying it from a renewable resource, the difference between those two prices is what the REC is valued at.
So just as on a process point, this kind of debate about the right way to get to each right number, that's the process that wasn't involved in this report generation. It's the process that would follow, right? If you wanted to use this report as a foundation for rate making, the gold standard is still what we did in Minnesota, which is you got these numbers on the table now, and you got a proposed methodology for how they can be calculated, and now you host a series of stakeholder meetings. We had as many as 300 in the room at a time over the course of those 3 to 6 months that we developed the actual number that was sent over to the commission for their approval in Minnesota. So you take this as a first pass, you let all these brilliant people criticize, it's too high, it's too low, the methodology is flawed, the methodology can be improved, and you have a process run by the commission, the staff, that says, okay, in the end, we're going to settle on this. They pack it all together and they give it to you. That's how you turn it into a rate if you want to do it. I'm going to go back to my other point, which is say the study gives you enough confidence that you don't have to do that unless you want to use study-based rates.
Thank you, Mr. Benshoff.
But
Mr. Chairman.
let me follow up. Let me follow up then. I hear you saying that, but you didn't explain the piece about the comparison between the current retail rates and what the report says. Mr. Borlick maintains that that's a subsidy of 4 cents or so. You didn't answer that.
Right.
If you don't do that other process, just do full retail net metering.
So
how do you explain that away?
if I was going to set a retail rate, I'll go to this is my core issue with the Daymark study. I would do a 25-year levelized cost of energy analysis. This report didn't do that.
I get it.
Can I make one point?
I hear you continuing to say two different things, though. Maybe my ear is not hearing what you're saying.
Sorry.
Can I just make one point about the data in the report in terms of the time frame? There is actually 20 years of benefits in the report, and those are located in Appendix C. So if one wanted to have 25 years of data, you could just extrapolate out an extra 5 years. So that would be available.
And again, you could do that. It hasn't been done there. So saying 7 cents in this report is apple and oranges, for example, for what I did in Austin. What I did in Austin is I took those full data tables, our consultant did, and I levelized them back to a number that you would use now. So I don't start at 7. What I do is I
I
start
understand, but I think I heard you say you're safe to stay at the full retail rate.
Yes.
And if you do that, there's a cross-subsidy to the solar generator.
only if you believe the 7 cents is the right value of solar calculation.
All right, thank you.
Just two clarifications, if that's okay, Chairman and Commissioners. The first is around, and I believe I misspoke, David, so I apologize if you misunderstood me, around sort of our perspective on environmental benefits and quantification of those. The position is that they should be quantified the same for all resources, that we can't just take solar and quantify environmental benefits for that, and especially, as sort of Mr. Borlick pointed out, distributed solar environmental benefits, but not give that same to utility scale solar. So I just wanted to clarify sort of my position on that. It wasn't sort of a coal versus renewable. It's all resources being treated equally. And then finally, just one clarification on Carl's gold standard. I would posit that the gold standard is actually not Minnesota, but Arizona. Arizona has taken the large-scale solar price and has sort of put that into their distributed generation tariff. Now they've slowly walked that down from the retail rate with an average of 5 years. So they've taken the PPAs that the companies have entered there for just solar energy. So the customers who are paying for that solar are paying the same price for whichever. There is a little T&D portion in there, as Carl mentioned. But I think something like that would be closer to a gold standard from a customer perspective. And I think Maryland is actually in probably a more positive position, given you're sitting within the PJM footprint. There's a market that is out there that you can clearly look at that helps us determine what the value of energy is. It's set in 15-minute increments by them. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Littell.
Thank you. I don't have any positions on anything, but I have given this question some thought, right? I've given it thought because I'm co-leading the rate design work group that is actually tasked with developing a pilot based on value of solar in the current commission order for PC44. So what would we do with this report? And so, I mean, my first observation would be to submit that I don't think we need to go to, at least the commission could not go to, there's sort of the extremes that are concerning, particularly perhaps EEI. I won't speak for EEI, but, oh my God, don't set a value, a net metering rate at 42 cents or 37 cents. And if it did so, at least my view of what regulators do is that the job is to get the most value at the lowest cost, right? You don't pay, say, well, this value we've calculated, and so I'm going to pay you that value. That's kind of like regulatory malpractice, right? If your value is this high, then you sometimes run an RFP process to see, well, what can you get it at? You try to drive the cost as low as possible. So just because something has a high value doesn't mean it's what you should pay for it. In a market, the supply and demand curves meet, right? But in classic economy, that means that a number of suppliers are willing to supply something for less, and a number of buyers are willing to pay more. But you arrive at the price, so there's consumer surplus there, and the task of the commission might be to maximize the ratepayer surplus, the consumer surplus here. So one view is you could accept a report and say this is valuable, thank you. It may inform a number of proceedings in the future, whatever those proceedings are. Net metering, the legislature certainly has a piece of that, and then it may give more pieces to the commission. But that determination, according to my understanding, is not entirely the commission's determination. And I'm working with other commissions, very different. We're on different procedural postures, but how to resolve many of these issues. And the stakeholders can, in one jurisdiction, State X, got very close to reaching an agreement on what those values should be. Very close. Ultimately, didn't get there, so the commission had to decide some of the disputed issues. So it's possible that the type of process that Mr. Rabago is talking about could play out, but that's an issue for the future. So again, I'll stop here. I have given sort of a little bit more thoughts on, well, what would the follow-through potentially be for PC44 here, and I'm happy to share those further with the commission, but I think I've probably said enough unless you want to pursue that.
Thank you. Are there additional questions today? Well,
Can I make one comment?
final comment.
Final comment. What Carl is proposing and what was done in the Minnesota study, I haven't looked at that study in about a year, but basically he's right. They ran out all these costs for 25 years, calculated the present value and converted that into a levelized cost. It did include the DRIPE benefit, which I think is incorrect. That should not have been there. I don't know whether it included the voided RECs. I don't think it did, but maybe Carl can tell us. But there's a bigger overarching issue here. You're forecasting something, you're forecasting avoided costs for 25 years into the future? You know, I don't know of any 25-year forecast that's right. The utilities forecast out 10 years in their RFPs, and those things often turn out to be dramatically different. So there's an inherent risk in putting all your marbles on a 25-year forecast and then locking that price in. That's why I think what I suggested, this buy all, sell all, which compensates the solar generator contemporaneously what his generation is worth then and now, not 25 years from now, but in the moment, and just rolls that forward. That's the most realistic way of dealing with this.
Thank you, Dr. Borlick. I think any weatherman will tell you that it's perilous to forecast out more than about a day or two, so forecasting 25 years obviously has some type of limitations. And Daymark's study actually recognizes that in section 1.3 that there are limitations to the value of their solar results. That said, I found that there are some very useful pieces that could be used as foundations in this study. We as Maryland could also look to Arizona, to Minnesota to see how they use their reports. At this time, based on everything that I've heard, I would have some concern moving forward with using this in rate design. That being said, the Commission does not need to put itself in a position today or down the road as to what necessarily to do with this report. We have received it. It's been accepted and noted when it was filed. The Commission may seek to act on this report in the future, but there's nothing that needs to actually happen today. During the break, I did Google what happened when this report was released back in November, and my memory was refreshed. There were some news publications that mischaracterized the process, so we should just get that on the record that when this was released or prematurely released, there was some inaccuracies at that point in time. That should not be associated with the official actions of this Commission. But this is to be continued. As I stated at the beginning, the state's solar policy is growing more robust each day with each solar panel that's installed. We're seeing developers in a record number of interest. That goes along with our new RPS goals if the governor ultimately signs that new 50% RPS into law. I appreciate all the comments that were filed by all the parties coming here to Baltimore today. We have taken them under advisement along with your comments today and Dr. Borlick, your proposal to the Commission. So we appreciate that. Do Commissioners have any final comments before we conclude today? Great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.